The Boston rain fell like judgment upon the cobblestones as Amy Clifford stood before the tall window of her father's study, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Behind her, two men discussed her future, as though she were a prize mare at auction. "The wedding will take place in 3 months," her father announced, his voice carrying the finality of a gavel. "That gives Margaret sufficient time to prepare a proper trousseau." "My son expects a wife who understands her duties," General Whitmore replied, his tone heavy with implication. "Thomas has particular expectations." Amy's hands clenched in the folds of her grey dress. She had met Thomas Whitmore exactly twice. The first time he had looked at her the way her father examined ledgers, calculating her worth. The second time, at a garden party, she had witnessed him strike a servant for spilling wine. When she gasped, Thomas had smiled at her, a cold expression that held no warmth. "You'll learn quickly enough that discipline maintains order, Miss Clifford. In all things." That night, Amy had made her decision. The planning had taken weeks. She liquidated the small inheritance from her late mother, money her father knew nothing about. She purchased traveling clothes, sturdy boots, and passage west under an assumed name. Her mother's sister, Aunt Catherine, lived in Santa Fe and had written years ago, extending an open invitation Amy had never thought to accept. The letter became her lifeline. On a fog-shrouded morning, while her father attended to business at the bank and her stepmother took tea with the ladies' auxiliary, Amy Clifford walked out of her family home, carrying only a single carpet-bag. She left behind her silk dresses, her books, her piano, and the suffocating weight of expectations she could no longer bear. The journey west was endless. Train cars rattled through changing landscapes, green giving way to gold, mountains rising like ancient guardians. With each mile, Amy felt the corset of her old life loosening, though fear remained her constant companion. What if her father discovered her absence before she reached safety? What if Thomas pursued her? What if Aunt Catherine had moved, or worse, no longer lived? Santa Fe proved both salvation and disappointment. Aunt Catherine had passed away the previous winter, her small house already sold. But the lawyer handling the estate remembered Catherine's mentions of her niece. "Your aunt spoke of you often, Miss Clifford," he said kindly. "She worried about you, trapped in that cold Boston mansion." "Is there anywhere I might go?" Amy asked, desperation edging her voice. "Somewhere quiet, where I might disappear for a time." The lawyer studied her face, seeming to understand more than she said. "There's a property in the mountains, about 30 miles north. It belonged to a trapper who died last year. Remote. Very remote. The territorial office hasn't managed to sell it. No roads, difficult terrain. You'd need to buy supplies for a long winter." He paused. "Are you running from something, Miss Clifford? Or to something?" "Both," Amy whispered. The lawyer made arrangements. For a sum that horrified her Boston sensibilities, but which the lawyer assured her was fair, Amy purchased supplies, a sturdy mule, and directions to the abandoned ranch. "The nearest settlement is 2 days' ride," he warned. "If you face trouble up there, there's no one to help." "That," Amy said firmly, "is precisely what I need." The journey into the mountains stripped away the last vestiges of the woman she had been. Her traveling dress grew stained with dust and sweat. Her carefully pinned hair fell into tangles. Her soft hands blistered from leading the mule over rocky trails. But with each step higher into the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, Amy felt something unfamiliar blooming in her chest. Hope. The ranch, when she finally found it, was a weathered structure of logs and stone nestled in a small valley. Mountains rose on 3 sides, their peaks already dusted with early September snow. A creek ran clear and cold nearby, and pine trees whispered secrets in the wind. The cabin was small, 2 rooms connected by a stone fireplace, but the roof seemed sound and the door still hung true on its hinges. Amy stood in the doorway that first evening, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and crimson, and felt tears streak her dusty cheeks. For the first time in her 23 years, she belonged to no one but herself. The weeks that followed tested every assumption Amy had held about her own capabilities. The cabin required extensive work. Gaps between logs needed fresh chinking. The fireplace required cleaning. The small barn needed repairs to shelter her mule through the coming winter. She had never done physical labor in her life, yet necessity proved a thorough teacher. Her hands, once soft and pale, grew calloused and strong. She learned to split wood, though her first attempts produced more kindling than logs. She learned to start fires, to cook simple meals over coals, to preserve food for winter. The vegetable garden behind the cabin had gone wild, but she cleared it, discovering forgotten potatoes and the stubborn resilience of herbs that refused to die. The solitude which she had craved sometimes pressed heavy upon her. Nights in the cabin were profoundly silent, broken only by wind in the pines and the occasional howl of coyotes in the distance. Sometimes Amy wondered if she had traded one prison for another, Boston's gilded cage for a lonely cell of her own making. But then morning would come, and she would step outside to air sweet with pine and freedom, and she knew she had chosen rightly. October arrived with a dusting of snow that melted by afternoon. Amy worked harder, knowing true winter approached. She stacked firewood against the cabin's north wall until it reached the eaves. She brought in the last of the garden's harvest: squash, dried beans, herbs bundled and hanging from the rafters. The lawyer in Santa Fe had warned her that once the heavy snows came, she would be completely isolated until spring. "Are you certain you want to do this?" he had asked. "A woman alone in those mountains? It's not natural." Amy had smiled grimly. "Neither is forcing a woman into marriage with a cruel man. I'll take my chances with the mountains." By mid-November, winter had arrived in earnest. Snow fell for 3 days straight, transforming the valley into a pristine white landscape that both beautiful and intimidating. Amy developed routines to structure her days. Morning, tend the fire, prepare breakfast, care for the mule. Afternoon, whatever work the cabin required, mending clothes, organizing supplies, reading from the few books she had brought. Evening, prepare dinner, sit by the fire, and try not to think too much about the life she had abandoned. She thought often about her father's rage when he discovered her gone. Had he sent investigators to find her? Did Thomas Whitmore care enough to search, or had her flight simply wounded his pride? And her stepmother, did Margaret even notice her absence, or was she simply relieved to have one less stepdaughter to manage? These thoughts circled like winter birds, but Amy tried to keep them at bay. She had made her choice. Whatever came next, she would face it as herself, not as the obedient daughter or the unwilling bride. The storm began on a Tuesday evening in early December. Amy had noticed the signs: a peculiar stillness in the air, clouds gathering thick and grey across the peaks. She brought extra wood inside, filled every pot and bucket with water from the creek, and prepared mentally for several days trapped indoors. The snow started gently, fat flakes drifting down like feathers. By nightfall, the wind had risen to a howl, driving the snow horizontal. Amy banked the fire carefully and retreated to her bed, pulling every blanket she owned over herself as the cabin shook with each gust. She must have dozed, because the knocking startled her awake with her heart hammering. For a moment, she thought the wind had torn something loose, a shutter perhaps. But then it came again, 3 deliberate strikes against the cabin door. Amy sat frozen in her bed, hardly breathing. No one knew she was here. No one should be out in this storm. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had her father found her? Had Thomas Whitmore tracked her down? Were there outlaws in these mountains, men who preyed on isolated travelers? The knocking came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice, deep speaking words she did not understand. Her hands shook as she lit a lantern and pulled a shawl over her nightgown. She had a rifle, the lawyer had insisted, but it leaned against the wall near the door and she was not certain she could actually fire it. Still, she grabbed it, holding it awkwardly as she approached the door. "Who's there?" she called, hating how her voice trembled. The voice came again, those strange words, followed by something that sounded like, "Help." Amy's breath caught, the wind howled, and she imagined someone freezing to death on her doorstep. But what if it was a trick? What if... The thud against the door made her jump. Not a knock this time, but the sound of something heavy collapsing against the wood. Terror and conscience warred in her chest. Finally, conscience won. Amy set down the rifle and lifted the heavy wooden bar. She pulled the door open a crack, and the wind nearly tore it from her hands. A man fell forward into the cabin, bringing a cascade of snow with him. He caught himself on his hands and knees, breathing hard. Amy stumbled backward, her scream catching in her throat. He was Apache. She knew this, though she had never seen one of the Apache people before. His long black hair was bound back from his face. He wore buckskin clothing and moccasins, now soaked and freezing, and there was blood, dark against the leather spreading from his left side. The man looked up at her, and Amy found herself staring into eyes as dark as mountain stone. He said something in his language, then tried in broken English. "Storm, lost, need shelter, please." Amy's mind emptied of thought. Every warning she had ever heard about savages crashed through her consciousness. Stories told by travelers, newspaper accounts of raids and violence, the casual racism that permeated even Boston's educated society. She should slam the door, bar it, reach for the rifle, but the man made no move toward her. He remained on his hands and knees, snow melting around him into puddles, blood dripping onto her clean floor. His face, visible now in the lantern light, showed pain but not threat. He was young, perhaps her age, and in that moment looked utterly human in his vulnerability. "Please," he said again, and the word came out on a shuddering breath. Amy made her decision. She shut the door against the wind, dropped the bar, and turned to face the stranger in her cabin. "You're hurt," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Let me help you." He spoke again in his language, and she thought she heard relief in his tone. Slowly, clearly struggling, he pushed himself up to sitting, his back against the door. In the lantern light she could see him clearly now, tall, even-seated, broad-shouldered and muscular, with strong features and skin like polished copper. The blood continued to seep from his side. "I'm going to fetch water and cloth," Amy said, speaking slowly as though that might somehow aid understanding. "To clean the wound. Do you understand?" He nodded once, his eyes never leaving her face. In them she saw wariness to match her own. He did not trust her any more than she trusted him. Somehow that realization calmed her racing heart. Amy moved quickly, gathering her washing basin, pouring water from the heated pot she kept by the fire, finding clean cloth. Her hands still shook, but purpose steadied them. When she knelt beside him, he watched her approach but did not flinch away. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to his side. After a moment, he nodded and carefully moved his arm to give her access. The wound was a deep cut, though not as terrible as the amount of blood had suggested. Amy cleaned it gently, grateful that her mother had insisted she learn basic nursing. The man, she really needed to know his name, bore her ministrations in silence, though she saw his jaw tighten with pain. "What happened?" she asked, working carefully. "How did you get hurt?" He seemed to understand her tone, if not all her words. "Slide," he said, making a motion with his hand. "Rocks." Storm came fast. Amy nodded, imagining him climbing these treacherous mountains as the blizzard hit. "You were lucky to find this cabin." Something that might have been a smile touched his lips. "Lucky," he repeated as though testing the word. She bandaged the wound with strips of cloth, working by instinct and memory. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of how bizarre this situation was. A strange man in her cabin, a blizzard raging outside, and she was kneeling beside him in her nightgown and shawl like this was somehow normal. "I'm Amy," she said, touching her chest. "Amy Clifford." He studied her face for a long moment. "Ilan," he replied, doing the same gesture. "I am called Ilan." "Ilan," she repeated, and saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, at hearing his name spoken correctly. The wind screamed outside, rattling the shutters. Ilan looked toward the sound, then back at Amy. "Cannot go," he said, and she understood he meant neither of them could leave until the storm passed. "No," she agreed quietly. "You'll have to stay here." For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other. Two people from different worlds, trapped together by circumstance and storm. Amy thought of all the fears that should be paralyzing her right now. Instead, she felt only a strange, settled certainty that something had changed in her life tonight. What that change meant she could not yet fathom. "Are you hungry?" she asked, standing and offering her hand. After a moment's hesitation, Ilan took it and let her help him to his feet. He stood nearly a head taller than her, and she noticed he favored his injured side. She guided him to the chair near the fire, then busied herself preparing food, leftover stew from her dinner, which she warmed over the coals. As she worked, she felt his eyes upon her, and understood he was reassessing his assumptions just as she was reassessing hers. When she handed him the bowl, their fingers touched briefly. He said something in his language, she thought it might be thanks, and began to eat slowly, his movements careful. Amy prepared her own bowl and settled on the small bench across from him. The fire crackled between them, and outside, the storm raged on. Inside this small cabin in the middle of nowhere, an impossible situation was unfolding. She thought of Boston, of her father and Thomas Whitmore, of the life she had fled. She thought of all the stories she had been told about the Apache people, stories of violence and savagery, and she looked at the wounded man eating stew in her cabin who had said, "Please," and "Thank you," who had not threatened or frightened her beyond the simple fact of his unexpected arrival. Perhaps, Amy thought, the most dangerous thing in the world was not the unknown, but the assumptions we carried about it. "The storm will last at least a day," she said, more to fill the silence than from any expectation he would fully understand. "Maybe 2. You'll need to rest, to let that wound heal." Ilan looked at her over the rim of his bowl, and again she caught that hint of a smile. "Rest," he agreed, "then go home." Home. The word hung in the air between them, laden with meanings neither could fully articulate. Amy wondered where his home was, if people waited for him there, if they worried about him caught in this storm. She wondered if he wondered the same about her. "Yes," she said softly. "Then you can go home." But even as she spoke the words, some part of her recognized them as a lie, because whatever was beginning in this storm-bound cabin, it was not something that would end when the snow stopped falling. She could feel it, as surely as she felt the warmth of the fire on her skin. Ilan finished his stew and set the bowl aside. His eyes were growing heavy, exhaustion and pain taking their toll. Amy stood and fetched more blankets, gesturing to the space near the fire. "You should sleep there," she said. "It's warmest." He understood her meaning and nodded his thanks. As he settled himself carefully onto the blankets, Amy retreated to her own bed in the other room. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the storm and the quiet sounds of another person's breathing in her cabin. She had fled Boston to escape a future decided for her by others. She had come to these mountains seeking solitude and safety. Instead, on this wild winter night, she had opened her door to a wounded stranger who should by all rights terrify her. But she was not terrified. Uncertain, yes. Cautious, absolutely. But some instinct deeper than reason told her that Ilan, whoever he truly was, did not mean her harm. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For tonight, the storm raged on, and 2 strangers sheltered together against the darkness, beginning something neither could have anticipated. Amy woke to silence. The howling wind had ceased, leaving a quiet so profound it seemed to ring in her ears. Pale light filtered through the gaps in the shutters, the particular brightness that meant fresh snow reflecting the sun. She dressed quickly, aware of Ilan's presence in the other room. When she emerged, she found him already awake, sitting upright against the wall with his blankets folded neatly beside him. He watched her approach with that same careful wariness from the night before. "Good morning," Amy said, her voice too loud in the quiet. "How is your wound?" Ilan touched his side gingerly. "Better, thank you." His English, though limited, seemed stronger this morning. Perhaps fear had clouded both their communications the previous night. Amy moved to the fire, stirring the coals back to life and adding wood. "Are you hungry? I can make breakfast." "I should go," Ilan said, and she heard both intention and reluctance in his voice. "Your kindness, I do not forget." Amy glanced at him, then moved to the window and opened the shutters. Snow had transformed the valley into an unbroken white expanse that came halfway up the cabin walls. "I don't think you're going anywhere today," she said. "Look." Ilan rose carefully and came to stand beside her. He said something in his own language, a curse perhaps, or simply acknowledgement of reality. "Much snow," he said in English. "It will take days to melt enough for travel," Amy said. "Your wound needs more time to heal anyway. You'll tear it open again if you try to climb through that." She could see him struggling with the situation, his pride clearly warred with practicality. Finally, practicality won. "I will help," he said firmly. "I do not take without giving." "You're injured," Amy protested, but he was already shaking his head. "Small wound. I have had worse." He gestured around the cabin. "You have work. I have hands. Something in his tone, dignity mixed with determination, made Amy relent. All right, she said, but carefully. If you tear that wound open, I'll be very cross with you. That almost smile flickered across his face again. Cross? Angry, Amy clarified, and then found herself smiling back. It means angry. As the days passed, a routine developed between them. Amy had been right about the snow. It was deep and showed no signs of rapid melting. They were trapped together, two strangers learning to navigate the strange intimacy of shared space. Mornings they worked together on necessary tasks. Ilan proved true to his word about helping. Despite his wound, he insisted on bringing in firewood, drawing water from the creek, though the walk through deep snow clearly pained him. He checked the mule in the small barn, ensuring the animal had adequate food and shelter. Amy cooked and tended his wound, changing the bandages twice daily. She noticed he bore the pain without complaint, accepting her ministrations with quiet gratitude. His stoicism impressed her, so different from the men she had known in Boston who complained loudly about the smallest discomfort. Communication came slowly, built on gestures, repeated words, and patient attempts to understand each other. Ilan's English improved daily, and Amy learned some words in his language. She discovered he was Chiricahua Apache, that his people moved between the mountains of New Mexico and Arizona, following traditional paths their ancestors had walked for generations. "You are chief?" she asked one evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner. She had noticed the way he carried himself, a natural authority even in this strange situation. Ilan considered the word. "Leader," he said finally. "Small band. My father was chief before. Now, I lead." "That's a heavy responsibility," Amy said softly. He looked at her and she saw understanding in his eyes. "You understand this? Responsibility?" "Yes," Amy said, thinking of all she had fled. "I understand running from responsibilities that would crush you." Ilan was quiet for a moment. "You run also from what?" And so, haltingly, Amy told him. About Boston, about her father's expectations, about Thomas Whitmore and the marriage she could not accept. She did not tell him everything. Some things were too painful, too shameful to articulate, but she told him enough. "This man," Ilan said when she finished, his voice hard. "He hurt you?" "Not physically," Amy said, "but I saw him hurt others. I saw his cruelty, his arrogance. My father didn't care. The marriage was about business, about connecting our family to military contracts and influence." She looked down at her hands. "I was simply the coin in that transaction." Ilan's jaw tightened. "Among my people, marriage is different. The woman chooses. Her family may guide, but force?" He shook his head firmly. "This is not honorable." "Your people sound wiser than mine," Amy said with a bitter laugh. "All people have wisdom. All people have foolishness." Ilan gestured between them. "You judge me by stories, yes? Before I come here?" Amy felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Yes," she admitted. "I had heard things about the Apache, terrible things." "And I have heard things about white people," Ilan said quietly. "Many terrible things, many true things." His eyes held hers. "But you are not all white people. I am not all Apache people. We are Amy. We are Ilan." The simplicity of his statement struck her deeply. "You're right," she whispered. "I'm sorry for my prejudice." "You open door in storm," Ilan said. "You help wounded stranger. This takes courage. This shows your heart." He touched his chest. "I see your heart, Amy. Is good." Something shifted between them in that moment. A barrier falling, a bridge beginning to form. They were no longer merely strangers trapped by circumstance, but two people choosing to see each other clearly. As the week progressed, Amy found herself increasingly fascinated by Ilan's knowledge. He taught her things about surviving in the mountains that she never would have discovered alone. He showed her how to read the weather in the clouds and wind, how to preserve meat more effectively, how to set snares for rabbits, though he apologized for not being able to actually hunt with his injury. "When I am healed," he promised, "I will bring you meat before I go, so you have food for winter." "You don't have to do that," Amy protested. "I want to," Ilan said simply. "You saved my life. This is small thing." In return, Amy taught him more English, and they fell into long conversations about their different worlds. She told him about books and music, about cities where thousands of people lived in buildings that touched the sky. He told her about the sacred mountains, about traditions passed down through generations, about a way of life increasingly under threat. "Soldiers push us," he said one evening, his voice heavy. "They say we must stay in one place, must farm like white men, must give up our ways. But how can we give up who we are?" "I don't know," Amy said honestly. "It's not fair. None of it is fair." "Fairness is like snow," Ilan observed. "Beautiful idea, but it melts quickly in sun." Amy laughed despite the serious topic. "That's very poetic." "Poetic?" "It means beautiful words, words that touch the heart." Ilan smiled, a full smile this time, transforming his face. "Then yes, I am very poetic." Their laughter filled the cabin, and Amy realized she could not remember the last time she had laughed so freely. In Boston, laughter had been measured, appropriate, always conscious of who might be listening. Here, with Ilan, she could simply be herself. The snow finally began to melt during the second week. Ilan's wound had healed well. Amy was proud of her nursing, but they both knew his departure was approaching. Amy found herself dreading it, though she tried not to examine why too closely. "You will be safe here alone?" Ellen asked her one morning as they watched the sun turn the snow to diamonds. "I've been alone for months," Amy reminded him. "I'll be fine." "Months before, you did not know what you did not know," Ellen said seriously. "Now you know the dangers. This makes them more frightening sometimes." Amy understood his meaning. Her ignorance had been a kind of protection. Now, having learned from Ilan all the threats these mountains held, she would face them with clearer eyes and perhaps more fear. "I'll be careful," she promised. "If you need help," Ilan said slowly, as though considering each word, "my winter camp is 1 day west. Follow the creek to where it splits, then take the northern branch until you reach Red Rocks. We will be there until spring." Amy's heart squeezed tight. "You're giving me directions to your camp? Why would you do that?" Ellen looked at her steadily. "Because you might need help. Because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with how to express himself in English. "Because you matter now. To me. Your safety matters." "You matter to me, too," Amy whispered. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of connection that went beyond gratitude or circumstance. They stood at the edge of something neither could name, both knowing that naming it might make it too real, too complicated. That afternoon, Ilan worked on the cabin repairs he had noticed during his stay. Despite Amy's protests that his wound was still healing, he insisted on fixing the loose shingles on the roof, reinforcing the barn door, and chopping enough wood to last her another month. "You are very stubborn," Amy told him, hands on her hips. "I learned from you," Ilan replied, and there was teasing warmth in his voice that made her heart flutter. On his last evening, Amy prepared the best meal she could manage with her limited supplies. They ate slowly, both reluctant to acknowledge that morning would bring separation. After dinner, they sat by the fire as had become their habit, but tonight the conversation came in fits and starts, weighed down by unspoken thoughts. "Will you return to your family?" Ilan asked finally. "To Boston?" "Never," Amy said firmly. "I can't go back to that life. I won't. But alone here, this is also hard life. A hard life I choose is better than an easy life where I'm a prisoner," Amy said. Then, more quietly, "You've made it less hard. These past 2 weeks, I didn't realize how lonely I was until I had company." Ilan was silent for a long moment. "I will come back," he said finally. "In spring, when the snows melt, I will check that you are well." "You don't have to—" "I want to," he interrupted, echoing his earlier promise about bringing meat. If you want me to come." "Yes," Amy said, and the word came out barely above a whisper. "I would like that very much." Their eyes met across the firelight, and Amy felt the weight of everything unsaid between them. She wanted to ask him not to leave, to stay longer, to tell her that these feelings building in her chest were not her imagination. But fear held her silent. Fear of rejection, fear of hoping for something impossible. Ilan stood slowly, and for a wild moment, Amy thought he might cross the space between them. Instead, he said quietly, "I should rest. Long walk tomorrow." "Yes," Amy agreed, though disappointment flooded through her. "Good night, Ilan." "Good night, Amy." She retreated to her room but lay awake for hours, listening to his breathing in the other room, and wondering if he slept or lay awake as she did, thinking thoughts he could not speak. Morning came too quickly. Amy prepared breakfast, while Ilan gathered his few belongings. The snow had melted enough to make travel possible, though still difficult. He would have to move carefully to avoid reopening his wound. They stood at the door as the sun climbed over the eastern peaks. Ilan looked down at her, and Amy saw her own conflicted feelings reflected in his dark eyes. "Thank you," he said, "for saving my life, for your kindness, for seeing me as I am, not as you were taught to see me." "Thank you for the same," Amy replied, her throat tight, "for showing me that strength and gentleness can exist in the same person, for teaching me so much, for—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "For?" Ilan prompted gently. "For making me hope again," Amy whispered. "I didn't realize I had stopped hoping until you reminded me how." Ilan raised his hand, hesitated, then gently touched her cheek. The gesture was brief, almost formal, but it sent warmth flooding through Amy's entire body. "Be safe, Amy Clifford. Keep your rifle close. Check your snares daily. Remember—" "I know," she interrupted, smiling through the tears threatening to spill. "Follow the creek north if I need help. Red rocks, I remember." "Good." He dropped his hand and stepped back. "Spring comes early to the mountains. I will return then." "I'll be here," Amy promised. She watched him walk away, his tall figure moving carefully through the remaining snow. At the edge of the clearing, he turned back and raised his hand in farewell. Amy waved back, and then he disappeared into the trees. The cabin felt impossibly empty without him. Amy stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the place where he had vanished. The rational part of her mind whispered warnings. He was Apache, she was white. Their worlds were incompatible. She was foolish to feel anything beyond gratitude. But her heart, which had been silent for so long, had begun to speak again. And what it said, over and over, was that she wanted to see Ilan again. That the weeks stretching until spring seemed impossibly long. That something important had happened in this cabin during the storm, something that could not be undone. Amy closed the door and leaned against it, letting the tears finally fall. She had fled Boston to escape a life chosen for her. She had not expected to find, in the midst of her isolation, the possibility of something real and true. But life, it seemed, had its own plans. Outside, the snow continued its slow melt, and Amy tried to imagine what spring might bring. Winter deepened after Ilan's departure. Amy threw herself into survival with renewed determination, applying everything he had taught her. She checked her snares daily, finding rabbits more often than not. She rationed her supplies carefully, supplementing them with the dried herbs and preserved foods she had prepared in autumn. But the long evenings by the fire were harder now. She had grown accustomed to conversation, to another presence in the cabin. Silence, which she had once craved, now felt heavy and sometimes oppressive. She found herself talking to the mule, recounting her day as though the animal might respond. "I'm going mad," she told the mule one evening. "I'm becoming that eccentric hermit woman that frightens children in stories." The mule, unimpressed, continued eating hay. January brought more snow and bitter cold. Amy had difficult days when she questioned every choice that had led her to this isolated place. What if she fell ill? What if the cabin caught fire? What if something happened to the mule? The what-ifs circled like wolves, and she had to fight to keep them at bay. But then February arrived, and with it, an unexpected visitor. Amy heard the horse before she saw it. She had been drawing water from the creek when the sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. Ilan had said his camp was a day's journey west. Who else would be riding through these mountains in winter? She ran back to the cabin, grabbed her rifle and positioned herself at the window. A moment later, a rider emerged from the trees. Not Ilan, but another Apache man, older, with gray threading through his long hair. He stopped his horse at a respectful distance from the cabin and called out in heavily accented English, "Message! I bring message." Amy's heart hammered. Slowly she opened the door a crack. From whom? From Ilan. The rider reached into a pouch at his side and withdrew a small leather bundle. "He sends this, says to tell you, be strong, spring comes soon." The rider tossed the bundle toward the cabin door. It landed in the snow, and Amy noticed it had been carefully wrapped to protect against moisture. Before she could respond or even properly thank him, the rider had turned his horse and was heading back into the trees. Amy retrieved the bundle with shaking hands. Inside the leather wrapping, she found dried meat, expertly prepared and sealed, and wrapped in cloth at the center, a small carving of a bird in flight, made from smooth wood. She turned the carving over in her hands, marveling at the craftsmanship. Someone, Ilan she assumed, had spent hours on this, shaping and smoothing the wood until it felt like silk. The bird's wings were spread wide, as though caught mid-flight, free and graceful. That night, Amy placed the carved bird on the small shelf above her bed where she could see it before sleep. The message was clear. She was not forgotten. Ilan had sent supplies and a reminder that spring would come, that his promise held. The gift sustained her through the final hard months of winter. When storms raged and the cabin walls closed in, she held the carved bird and remembered Ilan's almost smile, his quiet strength, the way he had looked at her that last morning, with an expression she still did not dare name. March arrived with the first true signs of thaw. Snow melted from the southern slopes, revealing brown grass and muddy ground. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt. Buds appeared on the aspens, and birds returned to sing in the mornings. Amy prepared for spring with growing anticipation. She cleaned the cabin thoroughly, aired out her blankets, and began working in the garden plot. She told herself she was simply engaging in normal spring activities, but she knew the truth. She was preparing for a visitor. The afternoon Ilan returned, Amy was working in the garden, turning soil with a shovel. She heard footsteps and looked up to find him standing at the edge of the clearing, watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. He looked different than she remembered, or perhaps her memory had failed to capture him accurately. He wore different clothing, buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork. His hair was freshly washed and hung loose over his shoulders. He carried supplies on his back, and she noticed he moved with no sign of his old injury. "Amy," he said, and the way he spoke her name like it was something precious made her heart stutter. "You came back," she said stupidly, unable to think of anything more eloquent. "I said I would." He moved closer, his eyes taking in the cabin, the garden, and finally her. "You are well? Winter was not too hard?" "I survived," Amy said, setting down her shovel. "Your friend brought supplies in February. And the carving. Thank you. It was beautiful." "You liked it?" Ilan asked, and she heard uncertainty in his voice that surprised her. "I loved it," Amy said honestly. "It's on the shelf by my bed. I look at it every night." Something shifted in Ilan's expression, pleasure mixed with relief. "Good. I was not sure if such a small thing would mean anything." "It meant everything," Amy whispered. They stood looking at each other, and Amy felt the weight of 4 months of separation, of long winter nights wondering if she had imagined the connection between them, of hoping and fearing in equal measure. "I brought fresh meat," Ilan said finally, breaking the charged moment. "And I promised to hunt for you. If you still want this?" "Yes," Amy said. "Stay, please, for a few days at least." "I will stay as long as you want me," Ilan replied quietly. That first evening felt simultaneously familiar and new. They fell back into their old routines, Amy cooking while Ilan cared for the animals, both moving around each other with practiced ease. But something had changed. The awareness between them had intensified, sharpened by months of absence, and the recognition that this was a choice they were making, not simply circumstance forcing them together. Over dinner, they caught up on the intervening months. Ilan spoke of his band's winter camp, of challenges they faced with dwindling game and increasing pressure, from settlers moving into traditional hunting grounds. Amy told him about the hard weeks, the moments of doubt, and how his gift had helped her persevere. "I have something for you too," Amy said after dinner. She retrieved a carefully wrapped bundle from her trunk. "I made this during the winter. I had to guess at the size, but—" Ilan unwrapped the bundle to find a shirt she had sewn from soft cotton fabric she had brought from Santa Fe. She had embroidered the collar and cuffs with a pattern she hoped approximated Apache designs, though she had been working from memory and imagination. "Amy," Ilan breathed, running his fingers over the careful stitching, "You made this for me?" "The fabric isn't as practical as buckskin," Amy said nervously, "but I thought maybe for warmer weather, or—" I don't know. I wanted to make something for you. Ilan looked at her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. The Apache people have a tradition, he said slowly. When someone makes clothing for another person with their own hands, it is a gift of great meaning. It says, I think of you, I care for your comfort, I honor you. Oh, Amy said softly. I didn't know, I wanted you to have something to remember. I do not need something to remember, Ilan interrupted gently. Every day of winter I remember. I think, is Amy warm? Is she safe? Does she think of me also? Every day, Amy whispered. I thought of you every day. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with everything they had not said, everything they had been avoiding naming. Ilan set the shirt aside carefully and stood, moving around the fire until he stood before where Amy sat on her bench. I must tell you something, he said, and after I tell you, if you want me to leave, I will go. I will not come back if that is your wish. Fear gripped Amy's chest. What is it? Ilan took a breath. Among my people, when a man wants to court a woman, he brings gifts to her family. He proves he can provide, that he will honor her. But you have no family here. You have no one to speak for you, to protect your interests. He paused. So I must speak to you directly and hope I do not offend. Amy's heart began to pound. Go on. I want to court you, Amy Clifford, Ilan said, and his voice was steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I want to bring you meat and help with your work. I want to sit by your fire and hear your voice. I want to know that when winter comes again, you will not be alone unless you choose to be. He stopped, seeming to gather courage. I know the world would say this is impossible. I know there are many reasons. Yes, Amy interrupted. Ilan stopped mid-sentence. Yes? Yes, I want you to court me, Amy said, standing so they were face to face. I've been trying not to hope for this, trying to convince myself that what I felt was just gratitude or loneliness. But it's not, it's... She struggled to find words. When you left, a light went out. When you came back today, it came on again. I don't care what the world says. I care about what we say to each other. Ilan's face transformed with a joy so pure it made Amy's throat tight. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he reached out and took her hands in his. His palms were rough and warm, his grip strong but gentle. I will court you properly, he said. I will not rush. I will not assume. You must tell me always what you want, what you do not want. Your choice matters most. My choice, Amy repeated, marveling at the words. Yes, my choice, and I choose this. I choose you. Standing there in the firelight, hands clasped between them, Amy felt more certain than she had about anything in her life. This was real. This was right. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The following days fell into a pattern that felt like the beginning of something precious. Ilan hunted daily, bringing back deer and rabbits that he taught Amy to properly butcher and preserve. They worked together on the cabin and garden, and Amy marveled at how much easier every task became with two pairs of hands. But it was the small moments that revealed the depth of their growing connection. The way Ilan would touch her shoulder gently when passing behind her. How Amy would find excuses to stand close to him while he worked. The conversations that lasted deep into the night, both of them reluctant to end the day and retreat to separate sleeping spaces. One evening, Ilan spoke of his responsibilities as a leader. My people need me, he said seriously. I cannot stay here always, though I wish I could. There will be times I must return to my band for weeks at a time. I understand, Amy said. I would never ask you to abandon your responsibilities. That would make you someone other than who you are, and I love who... She stopped, the word hanging in the air between them. Ilan's eyes were very dark in the firelight. Say it again, he said quietly. I love who you are, Amy whispered. I think I might love you. No might, Ilan said, moving closer until only inches separated them. I love you, Amy. Not might. Not maybe. I love you. Your courage, your kindness, your strength. The way you see me, not as enemy or savage or threat, but as man, as Ilan. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch reverent. May I kiss you? In my culture, in yours, I do not know all the rules. But I want to kiss you more than I want my next breath. Yes, Amy breathed. Please, yes. The kiss was gentle, tender, full of restrained passion and deep respect. Amy's hands found his shoulders, steadying herself as the world seemed to tilt and realign around this moment. When they finally drew apart, both were breathing hard. "I have dreamed of this," Ilan admitted, his forehead resting against hers. "Since winter, since I left, I dream of you." "I dream of you too," Amy said. Every night. They held each other close, and Amy felt something settle deep in her soul. This was where she belonged, not in Boston's ballrooms or society drawing rooms, but here, in the arms of a man who saw her truly and loved her anyway, who asked permission, who honored her choices, who made her feel safe and free simultaneously. Over the following week, their relationship deepened in countless small ways. Ilan taught her more Apache words, and Amy discovered a talent for languages she had never known she possessed. She taught him to read simple English, watching with delight as he slowly sounded out words from her precious few books. They talked about the future carefully, acknowledging the complications without letting them overwhelm the present. Ilan's people were increasingly pressured by the government to settle on reservations. Amy would eventually need to make decisions about her legal status, about whether she could truly vanish forever from her old life. "These problems are real," Ilan acknowledged one afternoon as they sat by the creek. "But they are tomorrow's problems. Today, we are here. We are together. That is enough." "Is it enough for you?" Amy asked. "I cannot come to your band as a proper wife. The others would—" "Some would welcome you," Ilan interrupted. "Others would fear you, distrust you. This is truth, but we do not need their approval to love each other. We need only our own hearts." "And when winter comes again," Amy asked, "will you stay here with me?" Ilan was quiet for a moment. "I must spend some time with my people. They need their leader. But I will not let you face another winter alone. We will find a way." He took her hand. Perhaps you could come to winter camp, as my wife, if you wanted this." Amy's heart leaped. "You would marry me despite everything?" "Because of everything," Ilan corrected. "In my tradition, we would have a ceremony. In yours also, I think. We can honor both, or create something new that is ours alone." He looked into her eyes. "But I do not speak of marriage yet. We court first. You must be certain. This life with me between two worlds, it will not be easy." "Nothing worthwhile is easy," Amy said. "You taught me that." As the days passed, Amy felt herself transforming yet again. She had fled Boston as a frightened girl. She had survived winter alone, becoming stronger. Now with Ilan, she was discovering what it meant to be truly partnered, not possessed or controlled, but respected and cherished. They made plans, careful and tentative. Ilan would return to his band to fulfill his obligations, but would come back in 3 weeks. They would spend the summer together, building toward a decision about their future. When autumn came, they would face it together. "I will tell my people about you," Ilan said. "Some will be angry, but they must know my heart." "I'll write to my aunt's lawyer," Amy decided. "There must be a way to legally establish my existence here without alerting my father. I need to protect myself, protect us." They were under no illusions about the challenges ahead. The world they lived in was not kind to relationships that crossed cultural boundaries. But they had something rare and precious, genuine love built on respect, trust, and the courage to be truly seen. On Ilan's last night before returning to his band, they sat together on the cabin's small porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Amy leaned against him, his arm warm around her shoulders, and felt peace settle over her like a blanket. 3 weeks, Ilan said quietly. "I'll count the days," Amy replied. "Be safe. Keep your rifle close. Check your snares." "I know," Amy laughed. "You've told me 100 times. Then I tell you 101. Ilan turned her face toward his expression serious. "You are precious to me, Amy. More precious than anything. The thought of something happening to you." "Nothing will happen," Amy promised. "I'm not the helpless girl who opened the door in the storm anymore. You helped me become stronger." "You were always strong," Ilan said. "You just did not know it yet." They kissed under the emerging stars, and Amy committed every detail to memory. The warmth of his lips, the strength of his arms around her, the sound of his heartbeat beneath her palm. 3 weeks would pass. She would survive them. And then he would return, and they would continue building whatever this relationship was becoming. When morning came and Ilan prepared to leave, Amy did not cry. She smiled instead, confident now in his promise to return. She watched him ride away, and this time when he turned back at the clearing's edge, she saw not goodbye in his wave, but see you soon. The cabin felt empty after his departure, but it was a different emptiness than before. This was the absence of someone who would return, not the loneliness of true solitude. Amy threw herself into preparation for summer, planting a larger garden than she had attempted before, repairing the barn more thoroughly, and organizing supplies. She thought about the future, their future, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. There were so many obstacles, so many ways this could become complicated or even dangerous. But she had learned something important over the past year. Playing it safe had nearly destroyed her soul. Taking risks, choosing her own path, opening herself to possibility, these were the things that made life worth living. 17 days after Ilan left, Amy heard horses approaching the cabin. She grabbed her rifle and moved to the window, expecting Ilan early. Instead, she saw 3 white men on horseback, and her blood ran cold. Even from a distance, she recognized one of them, Thomas Whitmore, her rejected fiancé, looking older and angrier than she remembered. With him rode 2 other men who had the hard look of hired guns. They had found her. Amy's mind raced. The cabin had only one door. She could barricade herself inside, but that would only delay the inevitable. Thomas and his men could easily surround the cabin and wait her out, or worse, simply burn it down. She watched as they dismounted, noting their superior numbers and weapons. Thomas looked around the clearing with obvious disdain, then called out, "Amy! Amy Clifford! I know you're in there! Your father sent me to bring you home!" Amy's hands tightened on the rifle. She moved to the door, opened it a crack and called back, "I'm not going anywhere with you, Thomas. Leave. You're not welcome here." Thomas laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Not welcome, my dear. You've been missing for nearly a year. Your father is beside himself with worry. Surely you don't think you can stay hidden in this hovel forever." "This is my home," Amy said firmly. "I left Boston by choice. I'm not coming back." "You don't have a choice," Thomas replied, his voice hardening. "You're engaged to me. That makes you my responsibility. I've tracked you for months, Amy. Did you really think you could disappear? That I would let you embarrass me by running away?" One of the men with Thomas began moving toward the cabin. Amy raised her rifle, pointing it through the crack in the door. "Stop right there. I know how to use this, and I will." The man halted, looking back at Thomas for instruction. Thomas raised a hand to stop him, but his expression darkened. "Let's be reasonable, Amy. You can't stay here alone. It's not safe for a woman. Come back to Boston, we'll be married quietly, and we can forget this entire unfortunate episode." "I said no," Amy repeated. "This is my home. I have every right to be here. I'm of legal age, and I'm not bound to you or my father." "Your father is your guardian until you marry," Thomas countered. "The law is on my side, Amy. I can have these men take you by force if necessary, but I'd rather not resort to such measures." His tone suggested he would very much enjoy resorting to such measures. Amy's mind worked frantically. She could perhaps hold them off for a day, maybe 2. But then what? She was outnumbered, and Thomas clearly wasn't going to simply give up and ride away. Her thoughts flew to Ilan. He had said 3 weeks, but it had only been 17 days. He couldn't know she was in danger. The directions he had given her to find his camp echoed in her memory, but could she risk trying to reach them with Thomas and his men watching the cabin? "I need time to think," Amy called out. "Give me until morning to consider your offer." Thomas exchanged glances with his companions. "Very well," he said finally. "We'll make camp here in your clearing. But Amy, if you try to run during the night, we'll chase you down, and I won't be so patient a second time." Amy closed the door and bolted it, her heart pounding. Through the window, she watched Thomas and his men set up a rough camp. They built a fire and settled in, clearly prepared to wait her out. One man always seemed to be watching the cabin, ensuring she couldn't slip away unnoticed. As darkness fell, Amy weighed her options. She could surrender, return to Boston, and condemn herself to the life she had fled. She could try to fight, but 3 armed men against 1 woman would not end well. Or she could risk everything on a desperate escape attempt. The decision crystallized. as she held the carved bird Ilan had made for her. She had not fled Boston only to surrender at the first real test of her freedom. She had not survived winter alone and found love only to let fear dictate her choices now. She would run. Amy spent several hours preparing in the darkness. She packed a small bag with essentials: food, water skin, flint, knife. She dressed in her warmest, most practical clothes and sturdy boots. Most importantly, she wrapped herself in the darkest blanket she owned, planning to use it as camouflage in the forest. The moon had not yet risen when Amy quietly lifted the loose floorboard in her bedroom, a precaution she had built during the winter. The space beneath was just large enough for her to squeeze through into the crawl space under the cabin. From there, she could emerge on the far side, away from where Thomas's men were camping. It was a desperate plan with a dozen ways to fail, but it was her only chance. Amy lowered herself carefully into the crawl space, pulling her bag after her and replacing the floorboard above her head. The space was cramped, dark, and smelled of earth. She crawled slowly toward the far side of the cabin, every small sound seeming impossibly loud in her ears. When she emerged on the far side, she paused to listen. She could hear voices from the camp, Thomas and his men talking by their fire. The mule shifted in the barn, but that couldn't be helped. She couldn't risk trying to take him. Amy moved like a shadow toward the tree line, each step carefully placed to avoid snapping branches. Her heart hammered so hard she feared its sound would give her away. But luck or providence was with her. She reached the forest without raising an alarm. Once among the trees, Amy began to run. The forest at night was terrifying. Tree roots grabbed at her feet, branches clawed at her face and clothes. She had no light to guide her except starlight filtering through the canopy. But she knew these woods now, knew the general direction of the creek that would lead her toward Ilan's camp. Behind her, she eventually heard shouts, Thomas and his men discovering her escape. Amy pushed herself harder, ignoring the burning in her lungs and legs. She had to reach the creek before they caught her trail. The hours that followed blurred into a nightmare of running, hiding, and praying. Several times she heard riders nearby and had to conceal herself behind rocks or in thick brush, hardly daring to breathe as they passed. Thomas was not giving up easily. Dawn found Amy miles from the cabin, following the creek as it wound through increasingly rugged terrain. Her clothes were torn, her hands and face scratched from branches. Exhaustion dragged at her limbs, but she forced herself to keep moving. According to Ilan's directions, she needed to reach the place where the creek split, then follow the northern branch to Red Rocks. The sun climbed higher, and Amy's pace slowed to a stumbling walk. She had brought food but couldn't afford to stop long enough to eat properly. Behind her she occasionally heard signs of pursuit, distant calls, the sound of horses. It was mid-afternoon when she finally reached the split in the creek. Relief flooded through her. She was going the right way. She followed the northern branch, climbing now as the terrain grew steeper and rockier, but her exhaustion was becoming dangerous. She stumbled frequently, her vision blurring. When she heard horses approaching fast, she tried to run, but her legs betrayed her. She fell hard, crying out in pain as her ankle twisted beneath her. Looking back, she saw Thomas and one of his men closing in. Amy struggled to stand, but her ankle wouldn't support her weight. Terror and despair washed over her in equal measure. She had come so far, fought so hard, only to fail at the last. Thomas dismounted, his face flushed with rage. "You stupid, selfish girl," he snarled, stalking toward her. "Do you have any idea what trouble you've caused? The expense, the humiliation?" "Stay away from me," Amy warned, though she had no weapons and could barely stand. "You're mine," Thomas said, reaching for her. "You signed an engagement contract. Your father agreed. You don't get to just run away. She is not yours." The voice came from above them. Amy looked up to see Ilan standing on a rock outcropping, and he was not alone. 5 other Apache warriors stood with him, all armed, all watching Thomas and his companion with hard eyes. Thomas froze, his hand inches from Amy's arm. "This doesn't concern you," he said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "This is a private matter between myself and my fiancée." "She is not your fiancée," Ilan said, his English clear and cold. He began climbing down from the rocks with fluid grace. "She is free. She has chosen her path. You do not own her." "The law," Thomas began. Your law has no power here, Ilan interrupted. This is our land, has been our land for generations before your people came. You are trespassing. He moved to stand between Thomas and Amy, his posture protective and unmistakably threatening. You will leave now. Thomas's companion had his hand on his gun, but he was clearly doing the math. 2 white men against 6 Apache warriors in their own territory. The odds were not favorable. This is kidnapping, Thomas tried. The army will hear about this. There will be consequences. Tell them, Ilan said. Tell the army that you came to Apache land to take a woman against her will. See what they say. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I think maybe they will ask why you did not seek her in the proper way through proper channels. I think maybe they will wonder about a man who must chase a woman into the wilderness because she would rather face death than marry him. Amy saw the moment Thomas realized he had lost. Rage and humiliation warred in his expression, but he was not stupid enough to start a fight he couldn't win. You'll regret this, he spat at Amy. Both of you. Your father won't stop looking. The Whitmore family has influence. Then let them use their influence, Ilan said calmly. Amy Clifford has broken no law. She is an adult. She can live where she chooses. If your father has complaints, he can make them to the territorial court. He paused. But I think your father would not like everyone to know his daughter chose to live in the mountains rather than marry the son he chose for her. Bad for business, yes? Thomas's jaw clenched, but he had nothing left to say. He remounted his horse, his companion doing the same. As they turned to leave, Thomas looked back at Amy with such venom that she shrank back against Ilan. You've made your choice, Thomas said coldly. Live with the consequences. Then they were gone, riding hard back the way they had come. Amy waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded before her legs finally gave out completely. Ellen caught her before she hit the ground, lowering her carefully to sit on a nearby rock. Amy, he breathed, and she heard fear and relief mixed in her name. When the scout reported white men at your cabin, when we saw you running, I thought I had lost you. How did you know to come? Amy asked, her voice shaking with reaction. You weren't supposed to return for another week. I could not stay away, Ilan admitted. I told myself I came to check on you, but truth is I wanted to be with you. When we saw the men at your cabin, saw you missing, I feared. He stopped, pulling her close. You are safe now. That is what matters. Amy clung to him, letting the terror and exhaustion finally overwhelm her. She wept against his chest while he held her, murmuring comfort in his own language. The other warriors kept a respectful distance but remained alert, ensuring Thomas and his companion did not return. When Amy had cried herself out, Ilan examined her injured ankle. It was badly swollen but not broken. We will take you to our camp, he said. You cannot walk on this. You will ride with me. One of the other warriors brought Ilan's horse, and he lifted Amy carefully onto its back before mounting behind her. She leaned back against his solid warmth, feeling safe for the first time since she had spotted Thomas approaching her cabin. The ride to the Apache camp took several hours. Amy drifted in and out of awareness, exhausted beyond measure. She had vague impressions of red rock canyons, hidden valleys, and finally a scattered collection of traditional wickiups nestled among the rocks. Women and children came out to stare at the unusual sight, their leader returning with a white woman. Amy caught whispers and uncertain looks, but Ilan ignored them, carrying her to one of the larger wickiups and laying her carefully on soft furs inside. An elderly woman entered, speaking rapidly in Apache to Ilan. He responded, and though Amy couldn't understand the words, she heard respect and affection in his tone. The woman, his mother, Amy guessed, began examining her ankle with practiced hands. My mother, Desba, will care for you, Ilan told Amy. She is skilled healer, best in our band. Thank you, Amy said to the woman, who nodded without smiling. Over the next few days, Amy recovered under Desba's care. Her ankle was tightly wrapped and elevated. She was given medicinal teas that helped with pain and inflammation, and though Desba remained somewhat reserved, she was not unkind. She brought food, changed bandages, and gradually began teaching Amy a few words in her language. Ilan spent as much time with Amy as his responsibilities allowed. He told her that his announcement about his relationship with her had caused exactly the division he had predicted. Some were curious and willing to accept her, others were deeply suspicious. But he had made his position clear. Amy was under his protection, and anyone who sought to harm her would answer to him. "Some will never accept me," Amy said one evening as they sat together outside the wickiup. "Some will never accept anything that challenges what they know," Ilan replied. "This is true in all people, all places. But others will judge you by your actions, not your skin. Give them time." Amy met some of those more open-minded individuals over the following weeks. There was a young woman named Nalin who had lost her husband in a skirmish with settlers and seemed to understand Amy's desire to escape an unwanted marriage. An old man named Chato who loved to test Amy's growing Apache vocabulary and laughed at her pronunciation. Children who were curious about her pale skin and hair, touching her hands and asking questions their parents couldn't always answer. It wasn't easy. Amy was conscious of being an outsider, of representing the people who were destroying this way of life. She tried to help where she could, assisting with food preparation, learning skills like basket weaving and hide preparation. She made mistakes and occasionally caused offense, but she learned. And through it all, her relationship with Ilan deepened. Away from the isolation of the mountain cabin, she saw him in his full context, as a leader, as a son, as a man trying to navigate impossible circumstances with wisdom and strength. She saw how his people respected him, how he resolved disputes with fairness, how he worked tirelessly to ensure everyone had enough food, how he made decisions that balanced tradition with the harsh realities of their changing world. One evening, about 2 months after her flight from Thomas, Ilan took Amy to a high overlook, where they could see for miles in every direction. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "I have been thinking," Ilan said, taking her hand, "about us, about the future." Amy's heart began to beat faster. "And I want to marry you," Ilan said simply. "In our way and in yours. I want you as my wife, my partner. I want to build a life together that honors both our worlds." He turned to face her fully. "But I must be honest about what this life would be. It will not be easy. My people face difficult times. The government pushes us harder every year to give up our ways. There may come a day when we must choose between fighting or surrender." "I know," Amy said quietly. "And the white world will not accept you if you marry me," Ilan continued. "Your father, your family, they will turn their backs. You will be considered lost, ruined. There will be no going back." "I don't want to go back," Amy said firmly. "Everything I want is here, with you." Ilan cupped her face in his hands. "You are certain, because once we do this, we face everything together, the good and the bad, the easy and the impossible." "I've never been more certain of anything," Amy said. "I love you, Ilan. I choose you. I choose this life." "Then I will speak to my mother and the elders," Ilan said, his eyes bright with emotion. "We will have a ceremony and you will become my wife." They kissed as the sun set over the mountains, two people from different worlds choosing to build a bridge between them. It would not be easy, they both knew that, but some things were worth fighting for. Some loves were worth any sacrifice. The wedding took place under a full moon 2 weeks later. It was a blend of traditions, honoring both Amy's heritage and Ilan's. Desba had softened considerably toward Amy and helped her prepare, braiding her hair and adorning her with traditional beaded jewelry. Amy wore a dress she had sewn herself, white in the style of her own culture, but decorated with Apache patterns Nalin had taught her. Ilan stood waiting for her, magnificent in ceremonial dress. The entire band gathered to witness the union, and while not all looked pleased, none raised objections. It was, Amy thought, as much acceptance as she could hope for. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Prayers in Apache, vows spoken in both languages, symbolic gifts exchanged. Ilan gave Amy a finely worked knife representing his promise to provide and protect. Amy gave Ilan a blanket she had woven herself, representing her promise to provide comfort and home. When it was done, when they were bound together by tradition and choice, Ilan whispered in her ear, "Now you are truly free, free to be yourself, free to choose your path, free to love." "We are both free," Amy whispered back. "Together." The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. There was food and dancing, stories told around the fire, and gradual warming from some who had been skeptical. Amy found herself laughing, truly laughing. surrounded by people who were slowly becoming her people. That night, in Ilan's wiki-up, now their wiki-up, they finally consummated their marriage. It was tender and passionate, full of the love they had built over months of learning to see each other truly. Afterward, lying in Ilan's arms, Amy marveled at the path that had led her here. "Do you have regrets?" Ilan asked softly, as though reading her thoughts. "None," Amy said. "Not a single one." The months that followed brought challenges, as they had known they would. Ilan's band faced increasing pressure from the territorial government. There were tense encounters with settlers, difficult negotiations with army representatives, and constant struggle to maintain their way of life. But Amy and Ilan faced it together. She learned to be useful to the band, earning respect through action rather than words. She became known for her medical skills, treating injuries and illnesses with a combination of what she had learned from Desba and her own Boston upbringing. She taught some of the children English, knowing it might help them navigate the changing world. And she worked alongside the other women, contributing to the community's survival. Ilan, in turn, learned from Amy's different perspective. Her education and outsider's view sometimes offered solutions to problems he hadn't considered. They became true partners, each strengthening the other. Spring came again, bringing news that made Amy's heart ache. The lawyer in Santa Fe, whom she had written to months ago, finally replied. Her father had indeed searched for her, but the trail had gone cold after Santa Fe. Thomas Whitmore had apparently not admitted to finding her, too embarrassed by his defeat. Legally, Amy existed in a grey area, not officially declared dead, but effectively disappeared. "I could claim my inheritance," Amy told Ilan after reading the letter. "My mother left me money that my father can't touch. It's not a fortune, but it could help. We could buy land, perhaps, somewhere on the edges of the territory where we could live in peace." "Is this what you want?" Ilan asked carefully. "To re-enter that world even in small ways?" Amy considered the question seriously. I think we need to be practical. Your people's traditional lands are shrinking. But if we could establish legal ownership somewhere, create a bridge between worlds, it might give us options." They discussed the idea with the band's elders. It was controversial. Some saw it as surrender, others as practical adaptation. Finally, a consensus emerged. If Amy and Ilan wanted to try this path, they had the band's blessing, though not everyone's enthusiasm. The process took months. Amy had to carefully navigate legal channels without alerting her father to her whereabouts. She worked with the sympathetic lawyer in Santa Fe, establishing her identity and eventually claiming the inheritance her mother had left her. With those funds, she and Ilan purchased a small ranch in a remote area where the territories of Apache land and settler territory blurred. It wasn't much, rougher even than Amy's original mountain cabin, but it was legally theirs, protected by white man's law. And crucially, it was positioned where members of Ilan's band could camp on the land without technically trespassing according to territorial law. It became a refuge of sorts, a place where both worlds could meet. Amy and Ilan lived there, but visitors from the band came and went freely. And gradually, carefully, they began building relationships with nearby white ranchers who were willing to judge them as individuals rather than representatives of their races. It was far from perfect. They faced prejudice from both sides. There were close calls with hostile settlers and tense moments with suspicious Apache from other bands. But they persevered, building something new from the pieces of their different worlds. 2 years after their mountain cabin meeting, on a crisp autumn morning, Amy gave birth to a son. Desba attended the birth, her skilled hands bringing new life into the world, while Ilan waited anxiously outside. When she finally allowed him in to meet his child, Amy saw tears in his eyes. "A son," he breathed, cradling the infant with infinite gentleness. "He is perfect." They named him Kai, meaning willow tree, something that bends with the wind but does not break. It seemed appropriate for a child who would walk between two worlds. Kai's birth brought unexpected healing. Even those who had been most skeptical about Amy seemed to soften when they saw the baby. He was one of them, but he was also hers. He represented possibility, hope that perhaps the future didn't have to be about division and conflict. As Amy held her son, watching Ilan's tender care, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had fled Boston, a frightened girl, desperate to escape a life chosen for her by others. She had survived winter alone, discovering strength she hadn't known she possessed. And then a storm had brought a wounded stranger to her door, and everything had changed. She had been terrified that night, opening the door to the unknown. But her choice to offer help rather than give in to fear had transformed everything. It had led to friendship, then love, then partnership. It had brought her to this moment, watching her husband cradle their son, surrounded by a community she had earned her place in through patience, respect, and genuine care. "What are you thinking?" Ilan asked, noticing her expression. "I'm thinking how grateful I am that I opened that door," Amy said softly. "How grateful I am for every choice that led us here." Ilan smiled, the full warm smile he saved for private moments. "I am grateful for the storm that brought me to your door, for your courage in helping a stranger, for your willingness to see beyond what you were taught to believe. We've built something remarkable," Amy said, looking around their small home. "Not perfect, but ours." "Perfect is impossible," Ilan agreed. "But this is real. This is true." As seasons turned and years passed, Amy and Ilan's ranch became known as a place where different worlds could meet peacefully. It never became easy. The tensions between settlers and Apache only increased with time, but they had carved out a space, however small, where love and understanding could exist. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Nasha, meaning owl, and another son named Keely, meaning sparrowhawk. Each child grew up speaking both languages, comfortable in both worlds, embodying the bridge their parents had worked so hard to build. Amy never returned to Boston, never reconciled with her father. Thomas Whitmore eventually married someone else, and his family's influence ensured that Amy's story was rewritten. She had died tragically in the wilderness, they said, a cautionary tale about foolish girls who ran away from security. Let them believe it, Amy thought. The girl who had lived in Boston had died. In her place had emerged someone stronger, freer, more fully herself than she had ever imagined possible. On quiet evenings, after the children were asleep, Amy and Ilan would sit together watching the sunset, paint the mountains with fire. These moments of peace, hard-won and precious, reminded them why every struggle had been worth it. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if I hadn't opened that door?" Amy asked one such evening. "I would have died in the storm," Ilan said matter-of-factly. "And you would have lived alone in your cabin, safe but lonely." "I'm glad I was brave enough to open it," Amy said. "I am glad I was brave enough to knock," Ilan replied, pulling her close. They had chosen each other across every barrier the world could construct. They had built a life together that honored both their heritages while creating something entirely new. And though the future remained uncertain, as futures always are, they would face it together, as they had faced everything since that storm-swept night when fear had transformed into possibility. Their children would carry this legacy forward, the knowledge that love can bridge divides, that courage means choosing hope over fear, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is open a door to the unknown and trust that what enters might transform your life in ways you never imagined. As the sun set over the mountains they both loved, Amy leaned her head on Ilan's shoulder and smiled. She had come west seeking freedom and found something far more precious, belonging. Not to a place or a people, but to herself and to the person who saw her most truly. And that, she thought, was worth every risk she had ever taken. The end. Dear friends, as we close this story of Amy and Ilan, perhaps their journey reminds us of universal truths that transcend time and place. We all face moments when fear tempts us to keep our doors closed, to retreat into what is familiar and safe. But what if the greatest blessings in our lives are waiting just beyond that threshold? For those of us who have lived many years, we know that life rarely unfolds as we plan. The path we thought we were meant to walk sometimes leads to dead ends, and the detours we feared become our greatest adventures. Amy fled from a life that would have destroyed her spirit. In doing so, she discovered not just survival, but true joy. Their love reminds us that connection can happen in the most unexpected ways, between the most unlikely people. They could have been enemies. Their cultures, backgrounds, and worlds were at odds. Instead, they chose to see each other as individuals, to build understanding through patience and respect. And perhaps most importantly, their story shows us that it's never too late to choose differently. Amy was 23 when she fled Boston, but age matters less than readiness. Some of us discover our true paths early. Others find them only after years of wrong turns. What matters is having the courage to take that step when the moment comes. So as you reflect on this story, ask yourself, what doors have I kept closed out of fear? What bridges could I build if I were brave enough to try? What possibilities await if I choose hope over habit? Remember, you are never too old to open a door to the unknown. You are never too set in your ways to learn something new. And you are never too isolated to connect with another soul who might transform your understanding of the world. May you have the courage to knock when you need help, and the compassion to open when someone knocks on your door. May you build bridges instead of walls, and may you never stop believing that love can transform even the most challenging circumstances. Thank you for sharing this journey with Amy and Ilan. May their story inspire you to write your own next chapter, with courage, compassion, and hope. With all our gratitude, the Wild West Whispers team. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of Amy and Ilan's story. If this tale moved you, we invite you to like this video, subscribe to our channel, leave a comment, and share it with others who love stories filled with hope, courage, and transformation. Your support keeps us inspired to create more emotional tales of love, redemption, and dramatic turns. Don't forget, another powerful story suggestion appears at the end of the video. Click and be surprised by yet another unforgettable journey from our storytelling world. Thank you for being here, the Wild West Whispers team.